Okay, let's go. Okay, so the first thing is just some housekeeping. If I can have the next slide. Clemmy. Yeah, so the housekeeping, basically a couple of things. The webinar is going to be recorded. And so if you can't see all of it, or if you want to share it afterwards, HPA will be sharing a video of it. Please do use the chat box to engage with each of the other attendees and with the speakers. We want to try and make these things as participatory as possible. And you can also use the Q&A box to ask questions, and hopefully at the end we'll have about half an hour and we can have some questions and answers between the audience and our speakers. And do tweet if you want to. The hashtag is hashtag #AWorldWithDrugs. Yeah, so we do want to make this as participatory as possible within the confines that Zoom allows. So make sure when you share in the chat box that you send messages to panelists and attendees. Otherwise, it'll just be the panelists who can see it. We'll also be posting some relevant links in the chat box as we go, so do keep an eye out for that. And you can always follow up with us afterwards if you miss any of them. So this series is hosted by Health Poverty Action in collaboration with 6 other organisations, which are the International Drug Policy Consortium, my organisation, Transform Drug Policy Foundation, the Transnational Institute in the Netherlands, the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition in Canada, Institut Doria in Mexico, the Interdisciplinary Centre for Cannabis Research in Jamaica, and the Legal Regulation Project also in Canada. We've got 5 panelists today who will be presenting for about 8 minutes each, and then we should have time for about 30 minutes of Q&A. Just make a few introductory remarks about why we are doing this particular topic. So the war on drugs has been undermining. Sorry, my daughter is calling me. Stop that. The war on drugs has been undermining progress towards the development goals for decades. It's fueled violence and conflict. It's undermined democracy and driven poverty, inequality, and poor health worldwide. The shift towards legal regulation of drugs provides a chance, an opportunity to begin to repair some of the harms of the past and to create a fairer and more just world in the future. We now believe that it is time to build a new approach to drugs that prioritizes, promotes, and protects health and well-being, and helps to address poverty and inequality and contributes to achieving sustainable development goals. One of the key challenges we face as we devise policy for this emerging markets is the profound imbalance between international established corporate powers and the millions of small-scale actors that currently exist within the illegal drug economy. Because for all its problems, the illegal drug economy does offer economic opportunities for many of the world's most marginalized people, and interestingly, some degree of protection from corporate actors, as they are not able to enter the illegal drug economy, or at least nominally not able to enter the drug economy. But as we transition into a post-prohibition world, that veneer of protection will disappear, and a significant number of potentially ill-prepared actors will be thrust into an unforgiving capitalist economy dominated by huge corporate forces. Unless something is done to level the playing field, it's a clash of cultures and a clash of power structures that they are unlikely to emerge well from. It is this potential exploitation by these corporate forces and what we can do about it that we will be focusing on today. Now, conceptually, corporate capture, or sometimes known as regulatory capture, refers to the means by which an economic elite pursue profit and power whilst undermining the realization of human rights and environmental protections by exerting undue influence over domestic and international decision makers and public institutions. In this sense, corporate capture acts as the root cause of many corporate human rights abuses. Now, the mechanisms of corporate capture will be familiar to everybody, even if the term corporate capture perhaps is not. So it's things like behind the scenes lobbying and soft lobbying activities such as hospitality provision. It's things like direct funding of political parties and proffering corporate dominated advice and expertise throughout the policymaking process, often via the funding of think tanks to influence national political agendas and policy debates, often under the guise of academic impartiality. Indeed, also through the funding of academic research, which is not necessarily bad in itself, unless it is used inappropriately or the research is cherry-picked or there are other forms of undue influence in how that academic research is produced. Also, we see corporate membership of national political task forces and committees. We see corporate membership of international level political task forces and committees also. And there's also the phenomenon of revolving doors, i.e. the movement of key personnel from public administration into the private sector and vice versa. Corporate influence seeks to shape the policymaking process in its own profit-seeking interests, to soften regulation, to weaken regulatory powers, to bankroll politicians and shape elections in its favor, or at its most extreme, to utilize state security services against communities that threaten their interests. The ever-deepening corporate-government relationship is weakening the state institutions and processes that are responsible for ensuring they can respect, protect, and fulfill their civic responsibilities. This relationship serves the interests of elites and corporate profit, and not the interests of citizens or the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is the threat to the new drug economies that are emerging in the post-prohibition world that we must face. Now, the good news is that people have faced down this threat before, and we are not powerless. We have a unique opportunity now with emergent legal drug markets to learn from mistakes of the past and design better policy frameworks. But this process is already underway, and the window of opportunity in this process to shape policy in a positive way is arguably a very narrow one. And that is why we need to engage the development field now so they can influence policy, deploy their expertise, deploy their advocacy resources to shape policy now at the beginning of this process, rather than then have to fight a rearguard action later on. Now, we can return to these themes after we've heard from our speakers, who will talk us through some of the conceptual and practical challenges and how we might be able to approach them. But I hope that's provided at least a basis of some of what the problem is, and hopefully we can try to come up with some of the solutions and responses during the presentations and in the conversation afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Kojo Koram. He's a lecturer at the School of Law at Birkbeck College, London. He's an author. He's an intellectual hero of mine. I think just over to you, Kojo. You've got 8 minutes before I rudely cough to stop you talking.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. First of all, could everybody give me a thumbs up if they can hear me okay?
You're up.
Excellent. Fantastic. Just to begin with, I just want to say how honored I am to be part of this panel, to be part of this conversation at this particular moment. Thank you to everybody who organized it, and thank you to my fellow co-panelists. You know, as an academic, I'm not at the cutting edge of a lot of these policy debates, both in drug policy and in developmental policy, as some of the other people you'll hear from tonight. So I think I'm going to start with doing some of the kind of boring work of somebody who spends most of their time cocooned within a library, of just trying to historicize this debate around corporate capture and around the context in which the questions around the role of commercialization of cannabis might take place in the future. Because I think it's important for us to just remember that when we're talking about the relationship between legal regulation of drugs and the commercial profiting from a potential drugs trade, and the relationship between multinational corporations, that this isn't the first time that such an arrangement would emerge. This is actually the kind of modus operandi through which kind of global drugs trade emerged before we now had the era of prohibition that's become so normalized that it seems to be just common sense. We forget that, you know, we really only start having kind of international drug prohibition around the turn of the 20th century with the 1909 Shanghai Opium Commission as the first instantiation of what then becomes the UN system of international drugs prohibition. But prior to that, in terms of the legal trade of drugs, that was something that was not only facilitated by the European powers of that time, but particularly pushed forward by the commercial and corporate entities of that particular moment. And I think it's important when we look at the history of not just drug law, but also the corporation, that we see how these things can be interwoven. Because prior to that moment of kind of European exploration, of European colonialism, the corporate form wasn't something that was particularly a commercial form. You know, when people came together as corporations, they came together usually for charitable purposes. If we look at the role of the corporation within the medieval period, it's limited liability for the purposes of forming hospitals or universities. It's only when we start to have the emergence of the joint stock corporation, in which people would share the liability for a particular ship as it went abroad, and then have a share of the different stock that was brought back from that particular exploration, that we start to have the rise of the commercial corporation that we're so familiar to us today. And so what was some of the stuff that was being brought back by those ships and being traded by those ships across the world? So much of it was psychoactive substances, stuff that is now completely interwoven with the kind of legitimate market, sugar, coffee, tobacco, but also stuff that is over the latter half of the 20th century become seen as the dangerous drugs of which international law and domestic law have to prohibit. The most obvious example of this would probably be the East India Company's profiteering from the opium trade, leading to the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century, a kind of world historical event in which the Qing dynasty of China is bowed by the power of the East India Corporation. But that wasn't the only example. You know, we can look at the VOC within Dutch Java, what we now call Indonesia, and their role of coca production. We can look at British coca leaf corporate production within places like Jamaica and Sri Lanka. And we can see how the arguments actually against prohibition at the kind of mid to late 19th century was actually the argument that it would disrupt the potential profits that could be accrued through corporate trade. And we can see this in one of the kind of great thinkers of political liberalism, John Stuart Mill, who in On Liberty critiques the attempt by the Qing dynasty of China to prohibit the trade of opium as interfering, and I quote, with the liberties of not just the producer and the seller, but also the buyer. And so I think we need to just remember how remarkable that period of prohibition that we now, at least in terms of cannabis, seem to be transitioning away from was. You know, David Corthwright, one of the major drug historians, states how it's almost unprecedented to have capitalism kill its own golden goose, to actually take something that's a profitable commodity and move it from the legal sphere into the illegal sphere. But that is what has happened with a plethora of drugs and also cannabis over the last 100 years. Some of the reasons for that, you know, in terms of my work, I really look at the relationship between racialization and the prohibition of cannabis, work that's been done. I'm sure most of the people attending this event would have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, but there's a lot of fantastic work that's done, not just with a focus on the United States, but also looking at places like the United Kingdom, where 1 out of 8 prisoners are currently in prison for drugs offenses. Drugs is the major reason for stop and search. You could also look at people like Michael Townsend's work in areas like Colombia, Sean Shelley looking at South Africa. And so there's a lot of other places where we can see the dynamic between racialization, criminalization, and the kind of violence of state repression. But that potential commercial appeal of these particular commodities never went away within that period. And so now that the organization and the advocacy against prohibition appears to be gaining success, at least in relationship to cannabis. We're starting to see that longer history of the relationship between capitalism, corporate interests, and the cannabis trade reconcile once again. And we can definitely see this not only within North America, where there's already quite a profitable, legal regulated cannabis trade, which I'm sure some of my other colleagues will speak to a little bit further. We can see that in terms of the debates right here in the United Kingdom. We can see the support that cannabis reform is gaining from some of the major institutions of the commercial world, CDAM newspaper, the Institute of Economic Affairs, the kind of leading free market think tank, that people really place as being the kind of driving force behind the Thatcherite revolution and the reimposition of the market within the society and economy of the United Kingdom. It's not surprising when we think about the profits and the value of global cannabis trade, that if profits are being made within North America, within Canada, within the United States, that these multinational corporations would also be looking at other jurisdictions, other markets that they may be able to enter into. And so, thinking about one more minute, I'll just try and wrap this up as well. I think a final point I really would like to make is that thinking about that history, thinking about the place that we're at the moment, I think we really need to try and emphasize the importance of ensuring the reform, as it happens, doesn't reinstitute an older form of particularly racialized and colonialized violence, but ensures that it's, as Steve said earlier, used as a moment in which we can try and change the presumptions and dynamics of global trade, not only with cannabis, but also with some of the other major commodities that may be produced in the global south, sold in the global north, and not facilitate that kind of shared equity of the profits that may be accrued from it. And so I'll probably leave my contribution at that point for now, and hopefully get to speak a little bit more following on from my colleagues in the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kojo. That was some really valuable insights there. I mean, I just think it's very important to be reminded that this is not in any way a new problem. I mean, since there's been international trade, this has been an issue, and it can be traced all the way back to colonialism and slavery, and it's not even like it was with different products. I mean, it was often with the same products that we're wrestling with now in a previous historical era. So I think that's a very important and useful perspective as we go forward, which brings us to our next speaker, who's going to tackle some of the same issues, but I think from a more immediate historical perspective. So now we're going to hear from Zara Snap. She's a long-time doyen of the policy reform movement. She's worked for the Students for Sensible Drug Policy. She was a key figure in the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and has more recently founded Instituto RIA in Mexico, working in the drug policy reform field, and is going to talk to us about some of her recent experiences with the emerging cannabis industries in Mexico and I believe Colombia. Over to you, Zara. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Kojo, because I feel like that gives us an idea of, were we better before? I'm not sure. And our great hope, and we're going to hear today, is whether we are better with legal regulation in some jurisdictions or not. And what are the clauses, and what are what can we build into laws to try and make them more equitable and ensure that they don't continue replicating neoliberal policies that extract resources and lives. I'm going to go quickly because I do have slides, and so I don't want to take too long. So we can just dive right in. Sarah, I think, is who's in charge of our. So under prohibition, and I'm based in Mexico, so this is from our experience, primarily in Latin America, war, conflict, violence, and criminalization is acceptable. countries receive international aid to fight drug trafficking, which is then used to buy arms, equipment, and technical capacity primarily from the United States, creating a perfectly round industry where we receive money to then buy products from them. The kingpin strategy of taking out the heads of drug organized criminal groups has resulted in splintering, fracturing, and greater violence as a means of asserting power as smaller groups emerge. Poverty facilitates the capacity to recruit for both organized criminal groups and the military. So definitely economic inequality is part of what spurs the possibility of all of this happening. The official narrative creates a public enemy, the other, which can range from people who use drugs to anyone associated with the illegal market. Thus, anyone who participates in this market were considered narcos, and we even create legal frameworks so that we fit into that, sphere if you participate in the market. Private corporations fund paramilitary groups in order to deteriorate the rule of law, displace communities, and have free reign for exploitation for opportunities such as mining. And then they often create alliances with certain organized criminal groups. Next, please. There has been little to no reduction in production or consumption. A world with drugs is our current reality, and it's going to be our reality probably as long as humanity exists on this planet. And our goal is that peace is possible with these plants and substances remaining as part of our world. Cultivating communities, which is one of our biggest concerns and one of our key stakeholders that we're seeking to privilege, are very stuck. They get paid low prices from organized criminal groups for their crops. They take risks to find better prices, which can put them at greater risk of their life, or they have their crops eradicated by the government. Less than 1% of the revenues, this is in Colombia. In Colombia, in the case of cocaine, less than 1% of the revenues remain in the country of origin, whereas 65% remain with retailers in countries of consumption. So there's also a very unbalanced equilibrium around hidden interests of maintaining how those revenue gains are distributed across the production chain. A neoliberal capitalist model is favored by prohibition for numerous reasons, including limiting access to substances that alter our own perceptions about the role that humans have on the planet and our own space. And I know that I start to get into a hippie place there, but we know that prohibition began because there was an anti-war movement that was challenging the status quo. And so there was a reaction to that, primarily in the United States. Next, please. So what can we do? We at Instituto RIA try to have continued to continue defining what social justice means and what a social justice framework within legal regulation could look like. And for us, it comes down to 4 principles, although there are many more that probably need to be taken into account. But this means actively confronting the dynamics of privilege and oppression. I recognize that I'm a white woman, although I was born here in Mexico, that provides me with very different status and capacity to speak about these issues, whereas there are many of my compañeros that are in the movement or that would want to speak out about these issues, it would be much harder for them because of the way they look. And that's something that's just entrenched in the way that our systems have worked, and oppression against people for how they look. We recognize the existence of groups that have been historically and are currently marginalized, which in Mexico is primarily people who use drugs and people who cultivate plants and psychoactive substances. And we need to work towards generating affirmative actions to level the balance of justice. So it's not just about creating a level playing field, it's about ensuring that there is greater equity, and finally, designating resources towards reparations. And here in Mexico, that has a lot to do with victims of violence and people who've had family members who've been disappeared. So we continue working to integrate this into our laws and our advocacy efforts. Next, please. So just a little bit on Colombia, and there's quite a few Colombians in the audience, so really feel free to bring up your points in the chat and differences or or things that you see are occurring. But Colombia is an example where there's been a focus on foreign investment and exportation. So they're really trying to export to the European market. This means that you need multi-million-dollar investments in order to achieve the good manufacturing practices that are necessary to enter into the EU market. And it really is a pharmaceutical model. So there is no flower, no cannabis flower that's accessible. It's only products. This is since 2016. You need authorizations from multiple ministries. There's not just one ministry charged with this. There are high barriers to access licenses. And as I said, investment is required. We've seen a large acquisition of land by foreign capital and around 56 hectares of medical cannabis being cultivated in Colombia. There are some things that they tried to do, whereas they tried to put in a rule that was 10% of the 10% of what any companies had to buy 10% of their product from indigenous communities or cooperatives. So, but what really happens is those companies buy that 10% and they destroy it. They don't actually use it. They don't use that rule to invest in the communities that could then increase their own capacity to be able to meet these high requirements. So it's a rule that was put in with great hope, and there's been very little capacity for it to actually have the assistance that they wanted. Next, please, because I know we're going to run out of time. In Mexico, we are on the verge of regulating cannabis. We have a deadline of December 15th. 2020. This comes from jurisprudence and 5 Supreme Court cases that were won under the rights of the free development of personality and the right to autonomy. And so now the Senate has to approve a bill, the Senate and the Congress, by December 15th. Next, please. So they approved the bill. They did a pre-approval of the bill on March 4th. Next, please. And social justice is mentioned in the first article of the bill, under the need also to reduce crime related to drug trafficking, promote peace, security, and individual and community well-being. And this is partly because of the work that civil society has done to push these issues to be at the center. Next, please. However, when you see it in the bill, it's much harder to see it. So this is just kind of the ways that people could access cannabis, according cultivation for personal use, cannabis associations, and a regulated market. Next, please. The things that we've been able to implement into the law that we hope could help avoid corporate capture, avoid monopolies, there's no state monopoly contemplated, is there are 5 types of licenses allowed. 40%, right now in the bill, 40% of cultivation licenses are for communities that have been impacted, communities that have had their crops eradicated during the prohibition of cannabis. And so we had advocated that 100% of the cultivating licenses should go to these communities. And you could do it if you put it under constitutional right around it's, part of our national security, or it's part of our economic development. And now we're advocating that it would be 80%, because we really want to privilege these communities and ensure that they are the first stakeholders that are taken into account as we transition the currently illegal market into a legal space. There are also limits on vertical integration and tracking requirements. And so right now, if you are just a normal business, you would only be able to apply for one of the 5 types of licenses. However, if you are one of those communities that's part of the 40% that already got one of the licenses for cultivation, you can apply for the other transformation, commercialization, import, and export licenses. And so this is a way that they would hopefully be able to actually take advantage of the whole production chain without being, whereas other companies will not be able to have more than one type of license. Next, please. And then I'm going to finish up very quickly. So these are some of our priorities is around, eliminating simple possession as a crime, which has to do with reparations. We do not want the repetition of crimes against people who use and possess substances. Eliminating the licenses for cultivation for personal use, increasing the percentage of licenses for cultivation, as I mentioned, and also including a citizen council on the governing board, which is something that was in a previous bill and they took out, but we really believe is important in order to have that counterbalance, and including a transitory, it's part of the bill, regarding the release of people currently incarcerated for cannabis offenses. So this is part of how do we repair the harms that have happened, whether that's to people who are currently being criminalized or people who are living on the margins because they're cultivating in their communities and they would like to transition to a legal market. It's dismantling a whole system is very difficult. And I do not think that we're going to achieve it in cannabis, but we have talked to people around fair trade standards. We've talked to experts, and it's really that it has to become legal for you then to kind of bring in some of those criteria. And while these markets are illegal, it's going to be very hard for us to even begin to pull those levers that might provide for greater equity. So I think that we will be better if we pass this bill. Yeah, I know. I think we will be better if we pass this bill, but I think that there are still risks that need to be mitigated as we move forward with this. I look forward to questions and hearing from the rest of my panelists. And thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Zara. Thank you very much. I think that was a really useful reminder, both of the realities and the horrific human and social costs of the war on drugs, and also that some of the practicalities and details of how we can address some of those issues and how we can sort of mitigate some of the costs of corporate capture and some of those risks are already in play. These aren't imaginary conversations in the future. They're discussions and debates that are happening now. And this is something I'm going to come back to at the end. I think it's going to be a recurring theme. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. I'd like to apologize if my internet is a bit sketchy. It seems to be coming and going. But anyway, our next speaker is Junior Spirit Cottle, who is the president of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Cannabis Party, and he is himself a traditional. Looking forward to hearing from you, Spirit. Take it away. Hopefully your internet's better than mine.
A very pleasant good day to all the viewers of this broadcast. You are going to hear from the horse's mouth, in that I myself is a traditional cultivator. I want to begin by asking for your patience while I make this presentation. And I'm so asking because I suffer from a damaged vocal cord, the result of a gunshot wound. And because I want you to understand me very clearly. In addition, and certainly most important, it gives me the opportunity to share with you a perspective that many of us may not have had the opportunity to hear before. Because the same people, the same big corporate interests who wants to monopolize the legal cannabis and to treat girls as underdogs are the same people who controls the mainstream media. Traditional cultivators have no aspiration of being lawless. We simply want to take care of our families. But we hear the history of these big corporations. Our challenges will be greater, as is beginning to happen to our counterparts in countries which have some level of legalization. We in St. Vincent and the Grenadines will not allow this because we see it as being aimed as imposing a new kind of colonialism on our people, and to deny we the traditional cultivators a space which is rightfully ours. We are living in a global village with rich nations on one side and poor and developing countries on the other, with these big corporations dictating the pace as well as the content. And so our fight must go beyond national boundaries to include like-minded people, both at the civil society and the policy level. In December 2018, or even before that, I must mention, I guess you don't know how it feels to have your field of cannabis eradicated by the narcotic people without having food to put on your table. I guess you don't know how it feels to lose your son while trafficking cannabis on the high seas as we do. But thank God, the table is beginning to change. In December 2018, the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines legalized medical cannabis and passed an amnesty law, which gave traditional cultivators 1 year to grow their weed as they're doing and to sell it to a licensed purchaser, thereby facilitating their transition from an illicit business to a licit one. Under medical cannabis law, a traditional cultivator is allowed to farm up to 5 acres of land without paying license for 2 years. The law also compels a foreign investor to purchase 10% of production from traditional cultivators. And at this very moment, we are talking, movement is on the way to provide traditional cultivators with land to farm cannabis. There are other developments, and we are fighting to deepen the process. Our ultimate goal is legalization, but we are taking it a step at a time. Finally, I want to say that we welcome foreign investors, that we welcome partnership with the money classes, but it must be guided by fair trade. It must be guided. We must ensure that we mutually benefit from this move. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Spirit. That was really, I think, just important to hear from. It's really important to people who are on the front line and experiencing this, you know, for real. We have all these sort of technical policy debates, and hearing from you and Zara about what things are really like on the front line, I think is an absolutely vital perspective. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who is Pauline Tiffen. She's been working in the field of trade and development for up to over 30 years now, I believe, particularly focusing on issues around fair trade, issues around social enterprises and certification bodies, and how we can ensure the interests of marginalized communities and working with people like the World Bank and the IFC, and issues around trade justice, fair trade, and she is currently the editor of the Journal of Fair Trade. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Pauline, and you can enlighten us with your years of wisdom in the field. And just to say, Pauline's not from the drug policy field. We thought it was going to be really useful to have people bring in a non-drug policy perspective. So I think it's more to do with chocolate and coffee. Oh, actually, chocolate and coffee kind of are drugs, aren't they? But it's a different perspective, which we're looking forward to hearing from.
Thank you very much. So yes, I wanted to start from the point of view of, and you'll find it in my short presentation, on what are the risks, what's at stake right now for smallholders, communities with traditional cultivation experience, as we have this new, very dynamic, emerging sector. And I wanted to try and draw out the key lessons from many years, as Steve politely pointed out, more than 30. I thought, what are the lessons really that we need to draw from this fair trade movement, work with farmers through to consumers, and also the livelihoods movement? Because this particular webinar is oriented towards the development field and development sector. And so I wanted to draw out what's so different from all the work that's been done with artisans and smallholders and cooperatives around the globe. So let's go to the point. Corporate capture, thank you, Steve, for your definition. That was very interesting. But I wanted to just like narrow it down for the purposes of what I want to talk to, which is primarily here, I think we mean when companies are involved who take much more than their fair share of the value of the thing, and they have no consideration, and in fact they're disinterested in ensuring or seeing producers and others in the supply chain as partners or as co-creators of product, and are pretty happy to leave them invisible and of course vulnerable. And so I'm going to start with what makes it possible, what makes it so easy for companies to have been exploiting, Kojo, to go back to your historic analysis, for far too many centuries, farm workers, producers, laborers of all types. Well, mainly because farmers and producers are not organized. They are atomized. They work on their own. They work with neighbors. They're seldom formalized because they live in parts of the state, the society, which is with the minimal of infrastructure, from roads to telephone to internet. And contrary to that, there's just a simple enormous imbalance of power. Power to control the prices, to discuss the prices, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail. So from a livelihoods and a development perspective, and from a fair trade development perspective, are the risks the same or different for cultivators of cannabis who are small and medium enterprises? Well, actually, most of them, I made a list, most of them are exactly the same. What's the same? They lack information of what's happening beyond the village. They don't know who is the real end consumer. They don't know what the consumer thinks, what they want, or what they want to know about who's producing it. They don't organize into effective, and especially for drugs, formal groups to bulk process, export, to go up the chain, the value chain, the supply chain. They seldom have good governance. How can you have good governance when you've experienced violence, criminality, and extreme forms of suppression from your government and from the intermediaries, the middlemen in the past? So when you're formalizing a sector, a new emerging sector, the traditional knowledge has to also be integrated with technical knowledge to speak to the quality. What are people talking about when they say quality? To speak to specifications and how to achieve them. This is what livelihoods, investments, and fair trade promoters have been working with for several decades to help small-scale farmers understand how to speak the same language and achieve the quality parameters that the market, the buyers, require. They lack finance to invest in what's needed, sorting, grading, knowledge, and the like. But all the same, even in very oppressive places like Colombia, it has provided as a cash crop, vital income for families and communities. And so does coffee, and so does cotton, and so do these other things. So what's different is we're moving away, we can hope, from billions of dollars invested in so-called alternative development, which Zara alluded to, and from diversification away from producing to a bit of celebration. So are the risks the same? Well, I think most of those risks and needs are the same at the very first level of production and organization. And we've seen 20 years of investment to help such marginalized growers, producers, cultivators, and rural communities to organize, to understand, and to access markets. There's 1,001 pieces of terminology. Making markets work for the poor, M4P, livelihoods, access to markets. You know, every few years there's a new piece of terminology, but the investment and the effort by multilateral institutions, the private sector, philanthropic foundations, corporate social responsibility, government development agencies, NGOs, international NGOs, everybody has been engaged in this. So I would say it's time for the development movement to be part of that, to reach these isolated pockets. What's different from a conventional crop would be all the legacies of criminality, the lack of the lack of financial skill sets, opening bank accounts, the social and psychological aversions to being transparent, to being organized, to building trust, and perhaps the belief that there is a way to balance export cash, local subsistence. In other words, we don't want to see a transition of cultivators from criminalized producers to unsustainable farming practices where hunger and food scarcity is the norm. So what are the other real risks, I think? I think the sector is really at risk of intellectual property value capture, which means taking traditional knowledge of cultivation, of production of seeds, seed management, seed propagation, of taking that without paying for it, of using brands, all the recognized images, all the recognized words that are associated with value and experience and quality and sensation, and the perhaps more supreme qualities and types of seeds and varieties. These are intellectual properties and they need to be defended. The heritage of it, the visual imagery of it, it's not free, it adds value and it has to be defended. There are lots of tools. This is not a new regulation that's needed. How do companies defend and protect and add to their intangible value? They use IP tools, a whole host of conventional tools, trademarks, geographical indicators, licensing, and they use it to reinforce and secure their own value. Often they take other people's value and pretend it's theirs. And I've been in some fairly epic battles with the Ethiopians against Starbucks and the Ethiopians against the American Coffee Association, trying to take their original heritage and of course original coffees, because all coffee comes from Ethiopia. There's some really great examples of how to do this, and there are a lot of agencies now that are beginning to realize this, and there are a lot of law firms that will do this work pro bono. But it's a really important thing not to let people take your seeds, not to let people take your names, and not to let people take your picture and let them use it without permission.
30 seconds, Pauline.
Okay. Yep. I think the other thing to really, really note is that there are plenty of frameworks now which require international companies to behave ethically. there is no reason why these should not apply to the companies that are working with smallholder producers and communities. And I think that it's really up to farmers and their allies, in which I hope we can include development organizations, to demand these best practices of all drug trade actors and businesses. They should be held to no less than the standards of sustainable business, traceability, inclusion, ethical practices than others. In fact, I would argue that what is needed for producers and communities involved in this emerging business to stay with a fair piece of the action is for those who are advocating for this to set for these companies in this new and emerging market a far higher bar. Because trust me, even companies that brag a lot, spend a lot, and say they're doing their best are nowhere near inclusion and traceability. And I do think that for development agencies, producers need a concerted new type of support, empathetic support in capacity building to organize and to formalize. And trust me, NGOs and development agencies know how to do this. They've been doing it for the last 25 years. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pauline. I think that's a salutary reminder for all our audience in the development field that there is this enormous body of experience and expertise in dealing with precisely the kind of issues that we're talking about today. But we do need to mobilize that expertise. The drug policy reform folks bring one set of tools and one body of knowledge to the table. But the people who've worked in the development field, who've worked on fair trade and trade issues, they know how these things work, and we need to bring these things together. And I just keep saying it, but this is an amazing opportunity for the development field to influence these emerging markets at the outset, to do it now, rather than have to battle against these entrenched industries in years to come. We can peg them down now and start to build the kinds of market infrastructure that we want to see. But rather than ranting on, I'm going to go straight to our final speaker, who is Cassandra Frerick. She's the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance in the US. It's a national nonprofit that works to end the war on drugs, which has disproportionately harmed Black, Latinx, Indigenous, immigrant, and LGBT communities for decades. And the Drug Policy Alliance seeks to build alternatives to the war on drugs grounded in science, compassion, health, and bring to us. So over to you, Cassandra.
Thank you. And so I want to say thank you to everyone for joining today and inviting Drug Policy Alliance to be a part of this conversation. We are really grateful to folks in bringing this conversation to the forefront, and really hoping to continue the conversation with our folks as we navigate the conversation around the regulation of all drugs. So I want to take a step back because I think we've talked a bit about the role that corporate capture has played in cannabis, but is also playing in other industries, and really have the conversation. And I think Zara started this point, which is the corporate capture of prohibition. And the fact that corporations have really already regulated prohibition in a way, and that we have multiple corporations that are multinational that have created a development structure around criminalizing and prohibiting psychoactive substances. And that as we have the conversation about bringing in development folks into the regulation of drugs, I think there is a case for us to actually talk to development folks about the industries and the economies that are in place right now and the infrastructure that is in place right now as we navigate prohibition. And I think part of the reason why this is so important to Dr. Koram's first point is that as folks talk about, or, the racialization of drugs, they originally thought that, slavery was an economy. It was based in infrastructure. It was a part of development. And so I think it's really important for us to acknowledge the ways that development has been a part of the harm that has happened to communities, the ways that corporations have been built. And so I'm thinking of the sugar companies, the tobacco companies, all of which that were part of the transatlantic slave trade that propped up and bolstered the infrastructure of the current economies of most of the developed nations in the Western Hemisphere. And so I think we have to start there to also understand not just the fact that the development world can come in and help us in navigating regulation, but that the development world also has a responsibility to help us take down the infrastructure and the economic infrastructure of prohibition that we are still navigating to take apart, right? And part of the reason why I think that's also important is because, as we know, prohibition morphs. And criminalization also morphs, and they're able to morph because we are rarely in a situation where we are actively interrogating the very infrastructure of the economies that they've created. And so in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, she talks about how we've moved from slavery to segregation to Reconstruction to mass incarceration. And I see that often we are seeing now that even mass incarceration, in the way that we are using in the States technology as a way to have prisons without walls, is the new morphing of it. And I think that in order for us to have a conversation about regulation, we really need to figure out how do we attack the corporatization and the corporate capture of criminalization and prohibition, because it is an effective development model. And we know that because it's being exported throughout the country and the infrastructure is only being strengthened. And I think part of the, I know the US has done cannabis regulation, and I think a lot of the things that folks are talking about here are based on the US models where we're seeing how things have gone wrong. But I also want to say that there are more examples of the way that prohibition has created access problems. And I think that when we look at the treatment model that is used in the US and the way that the corporations have taken over access to healthcare, if we look at prescription drugs and see the way that people have used that, in the US, we've had famous stories of corporations capturing money around EpiPens and asthma medication. These are not psychoactive substances. These are actually substances that are used for people to have access to healthcare. And our corporate model has already exploited that and then made it more difficult for those medications to go around the world. And we also see that when it comes to prescription opioids, where we're seeing that the US uses most of the opioids, has a very lucrative business model around it, and that business model has also impeded the access to how we're getting to other countries who are navigating really hard issues around pain management and don't have access to opioids. And part of it, people are using the conversation around the US overdose crisis as a red herring as to why people shouldn't have access to medication in other parts of the world. And so when we're talking about development and when we're talking about corporate capture, I think that there's so many more examples that we need to interrogate and start the conversation at before we even get to cannabis. Cannabis is the easy question that we have because it is what is in front of us, because it is an industry that we are creating. And I think it is useful for us to have the conversation around cannabis and about what are the do's and don'ts and how we can apply it to coca and heroin and all these other things. But I think in order for that to be truly informed, we have to look at the other models of prohibition and criminalization that have been monetized. Zara made the point around the militarization. Gun trades around fighting for the drug war is big business. And it's also often, drug prohibition is also often incorporated in development goals throughout throughout the world. And so like understanding that our conversation with our development allies who are on this call can't start with what do we do now if we want to create a world with drugs. We have to have the conversation with our development folks. How do we get rid of prohibition? How do we disrupt and uproot the development goals and incentives that come with criminalization? And I think that's super important because we have often used substances, be it sugar, be it coffee, be it tobacco, be it alcohol, as the thing that we have to focus on. Like we have to figure out how to regulate that model. But what we often miss is that the development model is based on the capture of people, the capture of poor people, the capture of marginalized communities, the capture of people that are furthest away from the power structures of the global economy. And so unless we have to have that conversation, because so much of what you are trying to avoid from what we see in the US around cannabis, we are, I think for us in the US, when we think about it, we are behind because we are starting the conversation at looking at how can we regulate cannabis in a different way that's more sustainable, as opposed to that cannabis is a symptom of a larger issue that started from the ways that we created development goals, infrastructure, and corporations based on the exchanging of human people.
Well, thank you, Cassandra. A lot to think about there. I think it's really useful to position this discussion in that bigger context, and also I think it's very useful to highlight what you described as the corporate capture of prohibition itself, of the enforcement and prison industries. I think that's something that I certainly haven't given enough thought to, and I think it's I'm grateful for you highlighting that. I'm going to barrel straight into some questions and answers because we're getting some really good questions are coming in from the speakers, but from the audience. But I had a couple of questions I just wanted to ask first. And if I could perhaps direct this one to Kojo and possibly Pauline and Cassandra. Although I'm mindful that we've only got 25 minutes left, so if people can keep their answers short, then we can get through some more of the questions. But Kojo, how do you think that this issue fits within the wider discourse on not just development, but I think also the wider sort of progressive movements that are pushing back against some of the excesses of corporate capitalism? You know, the issues around big pharma and big tobacco and big sugar and so on. You know, what do you think the possibilities are, and what are the limitations in terms of how drug policy reform fits in with those bigger international discourses?
Hello, can everyone hear me there? I'm not didn't get quite the end of that question because the connection became a little bit unstable there. But in terms of the relationship between
Apologies, folks. My internet is coming in and out. Have we lost Kojo?
I think so. So Steve, maybe it would make sense if you could write the question in the chat, because I think Kojo couldn't see couldn't hear the full question.
Yeah, apologies.
No worries. And I can also start answering, because I think your question was about how do we avoid something like how does corporate capture within the drug field? What's a wider discourse? How can we even fight like big tobacco, big alcohol, big weed? Is that the question?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I think part of the conversation that we have to do, and it's important to do at the beginning, is that I believe that the conversation of regulation needs to be divorced from commercialization. I think it is a concession that we have made in people's imaginations that the regulation of drugs means that it has to be commercialized in the same way. And I think one of some of the great work that Transform has done is by offering different regulation models. But I think the amazing thing about starting the conversation with development folks in the beginning is, what are different development and economic models that we could use as we can create different access points to people when it comes to these substances. And that doesn't mean like the over medicalization or the over regulation of it, but what are different economic models that we can use for drugs, ones that actually are sustainable and are less extractive or exploitative. And I think about that when we're thinking about coca, when we're thinking about poppy, and we're thinking about the farmers in different places where often their natural farming habits are being predicated based on the demand, and often can lead to some really extractive environmental outcomes. And so I think part of the conversation that we need to have a conversation around is working with people that are producing these things, the traditional cultivators, as Spirit said, and figuring out like what is a sustainable scale, and then also how do we interrogate people's imagination about what regulation means, because currently what regulation means is corporate capture. It means commercialization. It means big tobacco. It means big alcohol. It means big weed. And I think that as drug policy folks and as development folks, and specifically to the drug policy folks, our work is creating space for industry. And I know that I didn't fully appreciate that until regulation had left the station, because the focus was on prohibition, rightfully so. But I think it's important for us to really think through what are different regulation models, and also build a different consciousness around sustainability that is not extractive and exploitative to the natural resources that some of these drugs come from. Tag Kojo.
Steve, with permission, I'll add to it, because I think you're raising a really important point, and your question is good. But when I started working in cocoa, which is necessary to produce chocolate, in the 90s, in the early 90s, most people in Europe thought chocolate came from Belgium, right? There was no Africa in there, right? And I think, unfortunately, we're talking quite a few decades, but I do think, fortunately, different types of consumers have moved on a great deal. And just as not all chocolate is the same, and not all chocolate has the same credentials, right? And you don't look for the same thing on the tin or the bar, right? I do think that this is where a market segmentation, where you create best practice and you talk about it, is absolutely vital. And that will be, to answer one of the questions, is that will be at a smaller scale, and it'll have different values in the way it operates. It'll have different flavors and stories to tell. It'll have different social and economic impacts, because it'll come from real people who have names and whose pictures will be real and not just marketing hype. And this is the thing I've struggled with when Clemmy and Steve asked me to do this, because I don't think the challenge is helping to organize and creating a truly regenerative, restitutional segment. I don't think it is. And I think a lot of consumers, if they knew about this, would go for it, because they'd understand all the things that Zara used, and that Kojo talked about, that Zara talked about, that you're talking about. they would know it. They wouldn't have to read more about it. They know it. They read their newspapers, they listen to the radio. I think the challenge is slightly different. I think this is a new story to tell, not for the whole industry. We should regulate the hell out of Big Pharma and these nasty exploitative corporations. And we should still hold them to a higher bar than the apparel and textile industry. And we should hold them to a higher bar than the extractive industries, because God knows we don't want to go where they are, right? Which is nowhere. Awful. I won't go into the detail. However, I do think we need to think very carefully about how to engage with consumers on what is, after all, quite a complicated story. And Ria, I think, Zara, you put it so well. You know, everybody's a narco, everybody's a bad guy. You know, it's indistinguishable, you know, from the real story. And that's quite a tricky, you know, quite a tricky story to tell. But we do want consumers to gain the ability to discern what's what in this market. You won't be able to make everybody good. They won't want to be good, right? And there are laws to stop rape and pillage by corporations. But first we need to create the threat of a good example, as they used to call Nicaragua, right? We need to create the market threat, because that's how we've made the most difference in coffee and chocolate and lots of other products, because then you have the ability to call out the unethical and the exclusionary and destructive and coercive practices of any new actors in this sector, right? Because there's something to compare them with. And that's how we managed to create an enormous shift in the needle in many of the typical commodity markets. Now, I think cannabis is a fantastic one because, and in the journal that I'm working on, I'm most interested in what makes trade fair, not with a capital F, but fair and in a really rounded sense. And I'm happy to say we've just in our volume 2, we've got 2 parts, 2 sets of like 20 essays on atypical fair trade, and cannabis is one of them. You know, and so are some other really surprising things like software and all sorts of other things that people don't think of as fair trade. So I just think that is a challenge, but look at it. It took 30, 40 years to create really large numbers of people who get that there's a difference between this product and that product. So we don't have to create the ability to act on difference. We do have to explain what that is in practice.
Thank you, Pauline. And if you can share a link, if you've got a link to that, maybe stick it in the chat. I'd like to come to Zara and Spirit with a question now. Someone's asked, Steve Custer, I think from South Africa, has asked Spirit, can you speak to some of Pauline's comments about your efforts organizing and incorporating small growers, and about inclusion and protecting the interests of farmers and others involved in the traditional marijuana industry in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Could you just tell us a little bit about that, Spirit? I think that would be really instructive. And Zara, I'll come to you in a sec, if that's all right. Keeping it short, just because we've only got a few minutes. I want to hear from other people. Thanks.
In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, from the beginning, when the law was about to be passed, the traditional cultivators were represented at the parliamentary select committee levels. We have been having consultations throughout the country with the growers here of particular interest to the growers in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Is a law that is called the amnesty law. And I believe it is a force of its kind anywhere in the world. Now, this law allows traditional cultivators to sell their existing produce to investors or licensed purchasers in order to make some good monies. You know, the medical cannabis industry requires a great injection of funds. And it's one of the reasons why very often, or most times, traditional cultivators are not able to benefit from this industry. So the amnesty law helped to facilitate the transition of the traditional cultivator from the illicit cultivation onto the illicit cultivation. In St. Vincent and Grenadines also, traditional cultivators are going to be given lands to produce cannabis because it's one of the problems you have in other countries. Traditional cultivators doesn't really own the lands. So the government are now in the process of distributing lands to them. Traditional cultivators are making their voices heard at all levels. Traditional cultivators are involved in cooperatives. I think right now there's about over 45 traditional cultivators who have been issued with license. There are about 10 cooperatives, which consist mainly of traditional cultivators who have been issued with license. So you have perhaps nearly 200 cultivators who are issued with license in this country. So their participation is substantial, I will say. It's not a bed of roses. Everything is not perfect, but we are getting there. I also think there's an issue where people are calling for legalization. But one of the things that we must consider is that we are living in a society where there are different views, different perspectives. There are Christians, there are Muslims, there are we have to ensure that it is not a treacherous compromise. It is a compromise that will enable us to use it as a lever, as a springboard to deepen the process. I don't know if this has answered sufficiently the question of the
No, that's really
questionnaire.
That's really useful, Spirit. I think it's really good for people to know that there are examples, even if imperfect examples of where impacted communities have been involved in the policy development, and the policy development that's resulted from that has been positive and better than it would have been otherwise. So that's a really useful. It's really useful to hear from you on that. Can I go to Zara? Zara, there was a couple of questions which maybe we could combine together. There was an interesting question about from speakers' experience. Are there, in your experience, Zara, are there do governments and regulating bodies, are they happy to bring NGOs on board with their decision making, especially at the beginning of the legalization process? And I'm just mindful that I'm aware that you are an NGO, you are working with government in Mexico on development of the cannabis policy. What is your experience of that, and how's it changed from the past? And related to that, what would you want in terms of support from the development community and the development field to support your work and advocacy? And again, if you could try and keep it short, Zara, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. So I think it really just depends on the government, whether they're open to it, and it even depends on the government body. And so with us, the legislators have been much more open to NGO support and input on articles and language, whereas the Secretary of Health, which is in charge right now in Mexico of implementing medical cannabis, has been very closed off and have not opened the door to anyone. And that might be because of their concern about having any sort of influence either by us or by pharmaceutical companies. But it's also a much more conservative ministry in our country. So I think it really depends. I mean, we are advocating that within this cannabis regulation, and it's contemplated in the bill, there would be a new institute that's created to regulate it. And this is important, I think, because we would want this new institute to not have that same baggage that other government institutions might already hold, or interests that they might have. And so our goal is that we would have an institute that would want to motivate and propel forward this, rather than be an obstacle, which has been our experience with some of the government interactions. I think it's tough because I think you just have to fight for your place at the table, and that has to come with putting the arguments forward and always basing them in evidence. And that's what we've tried to do, and also bringing forward voices. And so I think civil society, government actually doesn't have connection to farmers or to cultivating communities, or even to people who use drugs and who use cannabis. And so it's also about how do we facilitate those conversations with stakeholders that they need to be having conversations with. So that is part of the added value that we bring to the table. Around development support, I think that we need development organizations weighing in on this. We need them to be coming out with papers. We are happy to work with development organizations on those papers, so that, because, and we've been saying this, we are not experts either in development or in fair trade or in sustainable development. We've specialized in other parts which have to do with criminalization, which have to do, kind of this prohibition piece. And so we want to learn, and us over the summer, for example, we did circles of study around fair trade models and what that looks like. What does justice look like in trade? But so we're trying to learn, and we need this conversation to be more dual, and so that it's back and forth. And I think that it would be important for large development organizations to weigh in on this and to take a position and understand that actually prohibition is undermining your work. It is actively undermining your work. And I think that's kind of the aha moment that we've had to have, and that we need to bring in development sector to help us get to that point. I know there was another question about how do we get, like with the Colombia model, with the 10% rule. I think it's really hard to this has been imposed on companies. And what I think needs to happen from the beginning is that there is a privileged space, that there are affirmative actions that are created so that those communities would have had investment. And that also means that then the government needs to be offering investment opportunities and a fund where then cooperatives or traditional farming communities can reach into that fund and have access. Otherwise, I think it's really hard to impose something on a company without them finding ways to just kind of slide out from under it. And there's so many good questions that
unfortunately we haven't got time to deal with them. I'm conscious we've only got 4 or 5 minutes left. I did want to ask Kojo if your internet's now working. There was a question here from Benoit Gomez, and I think based in Canada now. It was about the tobacco industry as a specific example, and I think the tobacco industry is held up, I think quite rightly, as a particularly sort of egregious example of corporate malfeasance and kind of evil, basically. Hang on, my pet disappeared now. It was essentially, what can we do? What can we learn from, the tobacco industry in particular, because of its sort of intrinsic similarities to the cannabis and other plant-based industries? I mean, it seems to have been so successful, but perhaps arguably has subsequently been brought to heel later. Are there specific lessons that you might take from that particular industry? And I'm just if you could keep this one really short, like a minute.
I'll try and keep it as short as possible.
Okay.
I think that there's obviously lessons absolutely that can be learned from it. I think one of the lessons is just in relation to the last point that you made, the regulation of the tobacco industry that we see is so strong is something that's particularly strong, within the global north, within Europe and North America, but not as strong when we start going into other areas of the world. When we look at, my family's from West Africa, and there you can see the kind of more cavalier approach to the tobacco industry, where it can advertise, the ability to make itself visible. And this is something that we want to avoid with the attempt to try and bring corporate capture to heel with global cannabis. We don't want to produce a system where, the corporate interest in cannabis is well regulated, well controlled, and relatively equitable within the global north, whilst allowed a free reign to kind of run amok within areas of the global south. And that is something that could be a possibility. So I think that's one of the big things that we want to avoid. But one of the differences, and this wrote into a lot of what Pauline was saying earlier as well, I think one of the differences that we might have with cannabis is that you do have a consumer base that has been marginalized and that has been pushed towards the counterculture for a significant period of time. And I think that that's something that corporate actors need to think about, is that who are the people who are going to be buying cannabis, and what is their feelings towards kinds of rampant exploitation, hypercapitalization, reinforcement of kind of racial extraction. It might not be the best, to think about it from a corporate point of view, the best marketing strategy to present yourself within those spheres, even more than it is with other kind of commodities, such as with chocolate or cocoa or tobacco.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the key lessons of one of the key lessons of tobacco industry is just don't do it like that. I mean, I think the examples of bad practice are kind of just as instructive as the examples of good practice. As chair, unfortunately, it's my responsibility. I've got to tie things up now, so if I'm just going to make a few closing comments, but I'd like to thank all our speakers for this, for their amazing contributions. It's been really educational for me, and I hope for the rest of the audiences. I think things I would take away from this are, firstly, that this isn't just a theoretical discussion anymore. This isn't like discussing legalization of drugs, over a coffee 15, 20 years ago. This is a process that's happening now, and bad things are also happening now, but good things are happening now too. We just need to focus our energy as drug law reformers, as people in the development field, as people from other fields, to ensure that it's that the good bits are winning the day, and that the bad practice is held to account and prevented from expanding. But really, and I know this is the third time I say it, but I'll keep saying it, we need to make sure that the development community is getting involved now at this critical juncture, because the window of opportunity is small, and really you do need to be engaging now, because if you're not at the table, your voices and your expertise won't be feeding into this process, and bad policy will happen as a result. I think it's clear that new ways new models and market structures are possible, and I think we should maintain that vision that there are better ways of doing things, but also maintain a degree of realism that corporate involvement is going to be a reality, but there are ways to ensure accountability and transparency in our dealings with corporations. Essentially, how to make them behave properly, how to make them behave well, how to make them put sustainable development goals at the center, or at least not marginalize them or just have them as purely a token thing. We can hold them accountable if we put in place the appropriate structures, and we're guiding the development. Guiding the development of policy processes now. It can be done. It is possible. We've heard from our speakers of examples of good practice. We've got this enormous legacy of expertise and scholarship from trade justice and fair trade within the development field that we really do need to be tapping into. I think really I would just end on that note that drugs is a development issue. The drug war has terrible impacts on development. There is a better way, but if we're going to optimize the opportunity of this, this dawning reform era, We do need to have the expertise of the development field in. You need to not just not drop the baton. I think you need to pick up the baton in the first place, because there's been, I'm afraid, pitifully few organizations who've actually, from the development field, who've really engaged in the drug field. Not that they all engage in the drug field, but not so much the drug law reform field. Drugs seem like something of a sort of toxic third rail issue. The idea of legalization and regulation is something that they feel uncomfortable with. We need to get beyond that, because if we don't do that now, the opportunity will pass us by, and then we will be fighting a rearguard action for a long way to come. I'd like our brilliant panelists. I'd like to remind everyone that this is the third in a series of 8 webinars exploring how legal regulation of drugs intersects with some of the most pressing issues facing the development sector. Do please join us for our next webinar in the series, which is on the 21st of October, on Wednesday, and we'll dive into the issue of trade justice and fair trade in more detail. Please do spread the word to your colleagues and networks, and join us for the rest of the conversation. There will be a series of publications emerging from this webinar series that we also hope that you will read and share. And please do remember, drug policy is a development issue. We need to stop ignoring this fact, and we look forward to exploring this in more depth with you over the next few months. Thank you very much.